So what's left? We've got to have an idea here. And the idea is complementarity, that men and women are equal and different, and that we can have those two things at the same time without having a conflict. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, there are two theories of complementarity. The first is, or which would be the fifth of our theories, is fractional sex complementarity. And this is the idea, and we can fall into this. This is kind of a little trick, is that men and women are different, and that we can sort of divide up human traits. Men are strong and women are gentle. Men are mathematical and women are literary, all this sort of thing. Now, the minute we start doing that, I don't know about you, but I react. I think, well, I'm good at math. I'm organized. My husband is neater than I am. I mean, you go through all these traits and you begin to say, that's not me. Those are stereotypes. And I don't want to be limited by stereotypes. And so we have to be very careful when we talk about complementarity that we don't sort of fractionalize humanity, because that's not what the church really teaches. What I think we have to look at is what Sister Prudence Allen calls integral sex complementarity. And what that basically means is that we're different and we're equal, but we're both fully and completely human with all the traits and characteristics available to all of us. Men aren't called to have one kind of virtue and women another. We're all called to be virtuous. We're called to be loving and giving. But the way we do that is shaped by our vocation as man or our vocation as woman, so that there are subtle, and they are very subtle differences between how I live as a woman with all of my womanhood and how a man lives as a man with all his manhood. And that we can find those differences by looking at the image that the church gives us, which is the image of the relationship between Christ as the bridegroom and the church as the bride, between God as Father and the church as mother. And that there's an equality here, but at the same time there are these very subtle differences. I like to think of it as our two eyes. Each human being has two eyes, hopefully both working, which allow them to have depth perception. The eyes are equal, they're just slightly apart, and they allow us to see the world just a little more fully. That if we were both the same, if there were no complementarity, then the human family would, in a sense, be limited to one vision. And that this integral sexual complementarity, totally equal, but different and total human persons, was planned by God from the beginning. It wasn't a mistake. God didn't say, oh, oops, there goes a man and a woman. I really hadn't planned that. No, he planned it to be an image of himself. We were created in God's image and likeness. Male and female, he created us. So there is something about being man and woman that allows us to image God in ways that if we were all just one sex, and God could have done it that way if he had wanted to, but he didn't. Some animals, they're sort of just lower animals, just one sex, but God said, no, I want two sexes, and I want them different because it says something about love. It says something about the Trinity. It says something about humanity. Now, do we understand all that it says? Not yet. And that's sort of the exciting thing about theology and about all these theological debates, because when we get challenged, when somebody says, the church is wrong, then the church comes back and says, no, we're not. But we hadn't really thought about this before. How do the differences between men and women help us to understand who we are, who God is, what it means to be church? And the more we're going to meditate on that, the more this document meditates on it, the more we are going to understand God's love, understand who we are, and be able to live in that freedom and that solidarity that God intended for us as men and women. So this is very, very crucial theology. And again, it builds on the whole history of the church, and yet in a very real sense, it's a new insight. The church doesn't reject any of its past, but it says, we hadn't looked at this before. And now that we look at it, we see there's so much more there than we thought there was. And it impinges on a lot of things that we stand up very strongly for. For example, our opposition to abortion and contraception. Our defense of marriage between a man and a woman is the only way to go, because it's the only way where there's true complementarity. Our defense of fatherhood and motherhood as really essential to the development of the full person and the importance of that. The image of all these things within the church. And one of the most contentious issues, the fact that the church ordains only men. And I know this is a very hot button issue, and I know many good Catholics are somewhat confused. Why is it that the church has refused to ordain women? Does it mean that the church doesn't think women are equal? Does it mean that the church doesn't want to give women power? And when we understand the differences between men and women, then we can see that what the Holy Father said in Mulieris Dignitatem about the ordination of women is that the priest is a sign of Christ the bridegroom, and the consecrated women are the sign of the church as bride. And it doesn't work if you've got a woman as the bridegroom. It just doesn't make any sense. So that and the church didn't decide this. The church, and the Holy Father makes this very clear, this is what has been given to the church from the beginning. And it's interesting that in the 1970s and 80s, people came and said, well, maybe it was just those times, that people wouldn't have accepted a female priest back in the early times, but now we're more enlightened and we can accept female priests. So why don't we change this doctrine and accept female priests? And the church looked at the question very simply. And first of all, they realized that was not a true analysis of the situation, because when Christianity came into being in the 1st and 2nd century and moved out into the Greek and Roman world, all the Greeks and Romans and all the pagans all had priestesses. They would have accepted priestesses as completely normal. But Judaism did not have priestesses. In fact, that's one of the things that made it different. And it was just taken for absolute sureness by the fathers of the church that you can't ordain women. And now as we meditate on it, we understand the complementarity, and that this relationship between man and woman, between fatherhood and motherhood, is essential to understanding who we are. So that in defending that, we are defending the truth about the human person, and we're defending the fundamental goodness of being women, because the alternative is, and this is what I see so often, you can't force men to be women. Any woman who's tried can tell you it isn't going to work. So what happens when you deny the differences between men and women is that women end up trying to imitate men. And they become, women can imitate men, but they're always going to be sort of second-class men. And men know it. They'll say, fine, you want to imitate us, go ahead. We're not going to object. But, it's not first-class womanhood. And it's precisely by defending the complementarity of men and women, defending the equality of men and women, defending the differences of men and women, that the church defends what it means to be a woman, that I don't have to imitate men, that there is something unique and special and marvelous in God's plan that made me a woman, and that I'm going to be a woman for the rest of my life, and I'm going to be a woman in heaven. When Mary was assumed into heaven, she didn't become gender neutral. She remained in her womanhood as a mother. It's one of the things that always touched me in the vision of Our Lady of Guadalupe, that she identifies herself as a mother, that in heaven, and appearing, she comes as mother. So there is an essentialness to our manhood and womanhood that isn't simply limited to what happens here on earth. And that's a very exciting thing. It's something we have to sort of to meditate on and to consider, that this was part of God's original plan at the beginning. It wasn't a mistake, that it is important now to our collaboration between men and women now in this time, and that in heaven we are still going to be men and women